Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Research Associate at the Acton Institute, and today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, John Pinheiro, Director of Research here at Acton, and Caleb Whitmer, who's Project Manager at our Center for Social Flourishing. Today we'll be talking about Pope Leo XIV's new apostolic exhortation, Dilexi Te, which is I Have Loved You, which was released yesterday and addressed to all Christians on the love of the poor. I want to begin our sort of roundtable discussion about this by reading paragraph 21, which is kind of like it's in the beginning of the document, but I think it gets to the heart of sort of what the document's concerned with, and gives listeners who maybe haven't had a chance to read the document a little bit of the flavor of what it is. And so this is paragraph 21, and we will link to this, of course, in our show notes. At the beginning of his public ministry, Jesus appeared in the synagogue of Nazareth, reading the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and applying the prophet's words to himself. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He thus reveals himself as the one who, in the here and now of history, comes to bring about God's loving closeness, which is above all a work of liberation for those who are prisoners of evil and for the weak and the poor. Gentlemen, do you feel exhorted? I do.
I do feel exhorted. I think that the document really works great on that level as an exhortation, as you read it. As I read it, I certainly felt my conscience pricked, I would say, that it definitely re-centers or centers care for the poor as a fundamental expression of the church's witness, and it makes, it draws from all across the church's tradition, thinkers, institutions, saints, and how they've cared for the poor up and down the centuries. And so yes, at the level of exhortation, I think it works wonderfully.
Excellent. John?
Yeah, briefly as well. I mean, it's important to keep in mind all the different kinds of documents that come from the Bishop of Rome. And so the encyclicals, and if we go back into history, centuries, or even decades, sometimes these mean different things in different eras, but we kind of divide them up in our mind usually, and an exhortation is meant to do just that. And he's exhorting us to have concern for the poor. And as I've often heard at Acton Institute events over the years, as I would think myself, you can't not love the poor and be a faithful Christian. It's just part of our faith. John Paul II said that Catholic social teaching is a key part of the evangelical witness of the church. It's just part of the whole mission of the church. Now, how we care for the poor, there's a lot of prudential questions to deal with, and questions of justice, etc. But certainly as an exhortation, I, too, felt my conscience pricked, I guess, but in the good sense. So I tried to read it with a hermeneutic of generosity, which is the way I want to approach any papal document, and the way I think anybody should approach any papal document or anything another person is proposing to you in good faith. The hermeneutic of generosity, how you read it. And as an exhortation, I think the best part for me was was going through the history of the church and Scripture and the fathers. So I enjoyed that very much.
Yeah. Let's turn to the scriptural element of this, because one of the most intriguing parts of the exhortation, right at the very beginning, is the fact that Pope Leo locates the dignity of the poor. Where is that source of that dignity? Where does that come from? And he thinks that comes from the very person of Christ. It's a very Christological understanding of this. And he provides an intriguing reading of sort of the woman that anoints Jesus at Bethany. And this is the tale where there's the woman who pours out this costly perfume on Christ's head. In the version in Matthew, it's slightly different in some of the other Gospels, but Matthew 26 is what Pope Leo mentions here. And he talks about that in the context of the poor always being with us. And he gives this very novel reading of the passage. What were your impressions of the way that Pope Leo dealt with Scripture in this exhortation?
Yeah, I think that that particular kind of exegesis of that passage, it's definitely not. That's not the, I would say, the obvious reading of that particular section. But it's a very fruitful one at the same time. So, in Matthew, what immediately happens after this encounter of Christ with this woman who, as you said, pours the oil over his head, the disciples are scandalized, right, by what she does, because she uses this extremely costly perfume and puts on his head. And the disciples, they say, why didn't you use this and give it to the poor? Or why didn't you sell this perfume and give it to the poor? And Christ rebukes them and says, the poor you will always have with you, of course, and she's done a beautiful thing for me. And he puts it in context of his burial, his upcoming burial. John, in the Gospel of John, he offers maybe a little bit more context for this, right? Where Judas is specifically the one who's taking issue with this, and John makes explicit that it wasn't because Judas wasn't scandalized this because he thought that money should have gone to the poor. He's the one who held the poor box. He wanted to take that money for himself, right?
Yep.
And so I think that's it. How the Gospels kind of interact with each other is interesting, right?
Yeah.
And I've always read that as John kind of setting the record straight, maybe a little bit in his Gospel.
And you see some hints of that in Matthew, because immediately after this incident, Judas goes and betrays Christ in that gospel account. Yeah. And I think you're right to point to, there are different senses in which the church reads Scripture, and this is not in the literal sense. This is in a sort of analogical sense. And I think putting this in dialogue in this way can be fruitful in a way to think about the poor and think about how we should see Christ in the poor.
Yeah, that question of seeing Christ in others certainly comes through in his interpretation there. And I thought, as you were speaking just now, I was thinking of Origen and the different senses of interpreting Scripture. And this kind of way of interpreting Scripture has, of course, been around for centuries. But that wasn't the bit of Scripture that stuck out to me. What stuck out to me more was his use of the Good Samaritan, which is, of course, kind of one of the common go-to parables in the Gospels when it comes to concern for the poor and how not to be indifferent. And so that was the one I thought more about. And if I recall correctly, he comes back to that at the end of the exhortation as well. Pope Leo comes back to it at the end of the exhortation. And that to me was more fruitful than this kind of, I would call it, the analogical reading of the woman. I've always interpreted that, and I think that's probably the common interpretation, as Caleb touched on, as there are things that we really don't put a price on, right? Mm-hmm. And it's something the sacred architect Duncan Stroik once wrote this essay talking about how the poor need beauty too, because you could just as well, and some of the Protestant reformers did make this argument that look at how opulent St. Peter's Basilica looks, or look how opulent some of these churches are. Why don't you tear them all down, worship outdoors, sell that money, give it to the poor, the next day? And the response has been that the poor need beauty too, right?
This gets to, there's a very holistic definition of poverty in here that I think is very fruitful. And Pope Leo talks about this in paragraph 9. He says, in fact, there are many forms of poverty. The poverty of those who lack material means of subsistence, the poverty of those who are socially marginalized and lack the means to give voice to their dignity and abilities, moral and spiritual poverty, cultural poverty, the poverty of those who find themselves in a condition of personal or social weakness or fragility, the poverty of those who have no rights, no space, no freedom. And he talks several other times about new forms of poverty. And he talks about forms of poverty that emerge in the 13th century in paragraph 63, and different forms of poverty today, following on more immediately after in paragraph 13. How is this holistic definition of poverty, how does it help us have a richer conception of what it is, to serve the poor, and then also what it is to see Christ in the poor? Because these are sort of operating at two levels in this exhortation. Caleb, you do a lot of thinking about poverty in our Center for Social Flourishing, and you all have been talking about this in a very holistic way since the center's founding. What did you think of this?
Yeah, we've always tried to use the language of social and material poverty in talking about what the Center for Social Flourishing is trying to do, and one of the big kind of outputs of the center is, we're making a new documentary film on poverty in the United States. And again, for that film, we always talk about it's a film about social and material poverty in the United States, because those two things are so intimately tied up together here. And it might even be more apparent in how intimately the two are tied up together here in the United States because of our general affluence, right, as a country, that those who seem to be struggling materially, it's often tied up with other forms of poverty that we should talk about, not in any kind of moralistic way, like their family broke up and so they're getting what came to them or something, nothing like that at all, but that there is a kind of familial or cultural poverty that people are experiencing that is horrible and it's tragic, and how you approach that is going to be different than simply if it's a material problem, right? But one of the that passage that you just quoted is it called to mind some wonderful quotes of some really, I think, heart-striking quotes of Mother Teresa.
Yeah,
and she's of course, one section of the document that I really liked is it's kind of a highlight reel or like a greatest hits of great. People who have reached out to the poor in the history of the church, and of course, Mother Teresa is in that list. But and she has a wonderful quote as well. I think she's quoted by John Paul II, who's quoted in the document. But one quote that came to mind here is Mother Teresa said, "We think sometimes that poverty is only being hungry, naked, and homeless. The poverty of being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for is the greatest poverty. We must start in our homes to remedy this kind of poverty." And then a kind of related line, this is maybe a more famous quote of hers, "In the West there is loneliness, which I call the leprosy of the West. In many ways it is worse than our poor in Calcutta."
Yeah.
So those came to mind in reading that.
No. John, what did you think of this more holistic approach to poverty?
Well, I was glad to see it. I think the document itself doesn't keep that holistic sense throughout by going through the greatest hits, particularly in history, in the history of religious orders and different groups and different individuals and associations, which in some way points to the importance of, I guess, non-state actors when it comes to charity, and the importance of not farming this out to government, to the state, so that then we're let off the hook. We don't have to be charitable because we know someone else is being charitable for us. So it's good, but you get the sense that I got the sense in reading the exhortation that we're talking mainly about material poverty here because it's mostly about almsgiving, where it's not about almsgiving and mercy, and it's a very wonderful exhortation on that. It is about accompanying the poor, walking with people, being with them, seeing Christ in them. So that spiritual aspect, I think, in the exhortation, Leo's joining together. The danger, of course, is falling into that trap where you think all poverty is material. So the good thing about that holistic view is you get it right up front, and I had underlined it here in my reading as well. The fragility is something important. That's a poverty we often don't think about because we think folks look like, well, they're okay, they're above the poverty line, but fragility is important. I remember when I was in college and when I was in graduate school, it was a trendy thing to do at the time for middle-class students to live in cardboard boxes for a night. And they would go out in the quad at the college, and they would to see what it was like to be homeless. And even then I thought, well, there's something missing here, and that's the fragility of not really being homeless.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're camping out with your friends. You're not seeing what it's like to be homeless and not really have a home, or being afraid of being abused, etc., by others and outcast. I mean, so I was glad to see the fragility and social weakness and the social aspect in the exhortation for sure. And I wasn't surprised. I was just glad to see it.
Yeah. When you talk about these greatest hits, let's turn to that, because this is another great thread of the encyclical. There's this scriptural thread, but there's also this thread of the church's own tradition of saints, particularly, but all sorts of people in the life of the church who have had things to say about poverty. And Pope Leo invokes a number of the early fathers, St. John Chrysostom, St. Augustine, and others, to explain that charity is not just something extra that we add on top that makes us extra nice people when we do it. But it's a matter of justice, and that care for the poor is essential to the unity of the church. And at the same time, and this is later, and we'll talk more about this almsgiving at the end, because I want to wrap up with that, because that's how the encyclical ends, and I think that's a great way to end an exhortation about this. But Pope Leo mentions that nowadays almsgiving is not looked upon favorably even among believers. And this was very striking. At first, I thought, my first reading of it was like, really? Because like we have, food drives, we have coat drives. Like, I think, in the median American parish, there's a lot of talk about the poor. And there's a lot that's done on the parish level for the poor.
And not even locally, but globally, I would say, especially in American parishes that have sister parishes and sister schools overseas.
Mm-hmm. That operate, there's a parish that operates a clothing drive here in town in Grand Rapids. There's a lot that's getting done on this level, but I'm trying to think, what is the charitable way to read this, where nowadays it is not looked upon favorably even by believers? And I think about, a lot of times giving is something that's uncomfortable for people to talk about. It's something that maybe people are comfortable doing, participating in, but as being part of their identity and who they are, maybe that's what the Holy Father is getting at, is that we're we talk about philanthropists, we talk about wealthy philanthropists, but the idea of giving is something that should be deeply embedded in the culture of ordinary people, is maybe something that we could do better to cultivate in ourselves. What did you both make of that?
Yeah, my initial reaction to that was, I was like, oh man, Sometimes you feel like how would I say this? It definitely works at the level of exhortation. I would say that, right? That I think that the you could say the genre of this is that some of these statements don't necessarily, it's not an encyclical. It's not kind of focused on sort of nuance and kind of drawing out, figuring out all the complexities of some of these questions. But that statement more is like, it's a 2x4 to the heart. It's a hard statement, and it forces you to think about it, right? Mm-hmm. Am I indifferent, right? Yeah. Am I is there a culture of indifference at my parish to the needs of the poor, and getting to that holistic question, or that holistic definition of poverty, I think it also calls us to be kind of creative in thinking about how do the principles that are kind of outlined in this document, how do we apply them, in our communities, and are we treating the poverty that is apparent around us, right? So that's how I tried to read it. So again, my initial reading, sometimes that to me was very much a kind of a Pope Francis statement, where which I often, because this is a really interesting letter, because, right, it's Leo, but it was drafted by Francis, as you were talking about before. And so there's a lot of kind of Francis's language here. And in some ways that's kind of a wonderful thing at this point, because it's kind of a letter from beyond the grave, right? Which I think is a really interesting aspect of this document. And so you can kind of really feel his personality coming through. And I think sometimes, Francis is so good as kind of a provocateur, right? Of like, he says something and people, people on the right aren't going to like it, people on the left aren't going to like it, but he kind of like puts it forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of forces you to react to it. And I think that's a great, a great kind of aspect of Francis, is that he's kind of forcing people to react to what he says, And so anyways, that's a long way of saying I think it really works at the level of exhortation, and it forces us to think, how fundamental to my witness as a Christian is care for the poor. Is it? Yeah.
And this is, yeah.
Well, I mean, so I'll speak to that because I had a bit of a different sense the first time I read that. There were, well, first off, on the Francis wrote it thing. So my understanding was around 70-80% of this was written by Pope Francis. He didn't finish it when he died. Leo says, I mean, I could quote him. I probably wrote it down somewhere, but something like, "This is mine. Like I've made it my own. I've made it my own." He says, and that's true. And of course, we also know secretaries and others who were ghostwriting and editing and helping. I mean, these are group documents. But the key is whose signature is on it. Leo XIV's signature is on it. This is like I remember telling college students, and we talk about Homer, and by the time they would ask all these questions about, did Homer really write the Odyssey? I'm like, just say Homer wrote it. It's fine. It's okay. Who wrote the Gospel according to John? John. It's fine. That's how we imagine the authorship, and that's great. Who wrote all of Reagan's speeches? Just say Reagan, right? I mean, it's fun to think about Hamilton maybe writing, Washington's farewell address and what that means, but anyhow. So in terms of authorship, it's important. It's important not to cross over into the realm of saying those are the Francis statements, and if you have this hermeneutic of suspicion left over with Pope Francis, you're reading those statements, and then the ones you're like, those are probably the Pope Leo statements, because I'm still pretty generous to Pope Leo, but just read it as an exhortation. Having said that, on the almsgiving, it was a very Francis-like statement in that it seemed, to me, accusatory with no evidence, and it made me wonder who he was talking about. Just like when he talked about economic ideas in some other places in this exhortation, and I thought, well, who exactly does he mean? Because when he's writing about the saints, he's quoting them. And most of this, I didn't run the numbers on this, but a lot of this exhortation are direct quotations. He has the same habit that Pope Francis had, which is quoting Pope Francis. And there's a lot of Pope Francis quoted in this document. But there's Augustine, there's St. Basil, there's St. Benedict. There's a whole bunch of folks in here. Not as much John Paul as I would have expected from a Leo XIV, especially Centesimus Annus is notably missing, except for one little quote. But the purpose of the exhortation is not really to dig into those kind of details that maybe John Paul did in terms of the economy. So the danger I came away with that statement about believers is we need to know what we really mean by almsgiving, and whether you mentioned justice, if giving direct alms, me giving you something right now, is actually the just thing to do, it may be the unjust thing to do. There may be a better way to help you than doing that. But if we come away only conceiving of me putting something material in your hands or over your head, we might miss the boat. And
part of it struck me too is part of it is we have this wonderful tradition in the Catholic Church, but in Christianity as a whole, of this really being the center of the religion in a way that is remarkable if you step outside that religion. I wrote a piece for Religion and Liberty on Swami Vivekananda, for instance. And when he founded the sort of Ramakrishna mission and the Ramakrishna order, many of his brother monks were very skeptical of this sort of social service sort of thing, like providing people with food, providing people with medicine, providing people with shelter. They're like, no, we're in this to escape this material world. We're in this to escape this delusion. This is all a distraction. And he pushed back hard against the sort of Hindu religious establishment at the time. And he talks very explicitly in his writings about how his trip to America and his seeing how social services and civil society was ordered here around particularly religious folks and religious communities providing this sort of service was something that was very alien to the society he came from. So I think often when we're Christians, we should be introspective and we should be critical of our own attitudes, and we should be open to being exhorted. But at the same time, there is something very unique and wonderful and new in the way that Christianity has brought the poor to the center of what it is to be the church in the world.
And it's always been like that. I mean, in the ancient Roman world, the Christians really stood apart for that fact. And they later went on to invent the hospital. And Pope Leo talks about that. They later went on to invent poorhouses, etc. And this is one of the things that made the mendicant orders so popular, is when the bishops ran away and the nobility ran away during the Black Death, they were the only ones who remained in the cities and towns to minister to the people. And so that idea of walking with the suffering is surely key. So we have prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, and the three go together in Christian spirituality. The question becomes, what does almsgiving look like maybe in the 21st century? Mm-hmm. And it still looks like alms sometimes, and emergency aid, and helping the person with the need they have now. But then you also think, like, how did they end up in that position? And what can I do to help them, but also prevent others from ending up in this terrible position, this fragile position, et cetera? Those are bigger questions, and they're not the kind of questions you would look for an exhortation mm-hmm. to answer. And it doesn't answer those.
Yeah. It does tell us or try to tell us something, though, about our present circumstances. And this is where I want to turn to where the exhortation touches on the economy. And in the exhortation, the economy and the market is referred to in a very sort of monolithic way, and sometimes even as sort of like a malevolent force in the world. How do we... This is not... and this is something that you see in a lot of places, and a lot of even like business journalism. You get this, the economy did X or did Y, and it's very common as people to sort of fall back and think of the economy as a sort of reified thing that does things rather than as a continuous unfolding process. What did you think of this sort of language around the economy in the exhortation and the sort of framing of sort of the economic realities of the 21st century?
Yeah, if I can just read one sentence from one of those paragraphs. I think this is paragraph 114. Pope Leo says, "At times, pseudoscientific data are invoked to support the claims that a free market economy will automatically solve the problem of poverty." And he goes on. And I think that the key word there is automatically, right? There are better and worse ways to talk about what the market does, right? Mm-hmm. And there's maybe a little bit of a straw man here, or I feel a little bit of a straw man there. But I think charitably, we can read it. There are definitely people who talk about, if we get the free market and, to this mm-hmm. such and such country, then that's going to solve the problems. No, there are market actors within the economy. You need access to capital investment. You need access to expertise, and in developing, kind of institutions that encourage good activity in that market economy. And so I think that it's in. I think that we can read the sections on the economy charitably, but I do think that there's a missed opportunity in the in this document to think more theologically about the market, I would say, and kind of the the other-oriented nature that one has to adopt in order to succeed in a market, right? You need to be looking out for the interests and the wants and the desires of other people, right? And so I think that is there's an opportunity for rich theological reflection there that fits in with this document, but you could say he leaves that on the table.
And I think maybe leaving Centesimus Annus, which has a couple of lovely paragraphs in section 42 on if by capitalism you mean. And he gives a list, and that's great. Now, if you mean this other thing, and I think what we get in the exhortation is this sense that so when he talks about pseudoscientific data, he also puts sneer quotes around the word interpreted, looking beyond the data, which is sometimes interpreted to convince us that the situation of the poor is not so serious, the overall reality is quite evident, and he goes on to make empirical claims that actually are they're just wrong about the increase in the numbers of the poor. And I looked up, if I may,
absolutely.
I looked up UN World Bank data, and he cites the United Nations in here as a goal of eradicating poverty. And in 1990, the extreme poverty rate was 38%. That was down to 11% before COVID. It's around 10% now, even though there were difficulties following COVID and still are. But it's actually fallen by half in the last 10 years, according to the UN. And most of the extreme poverty is in sub-Saharan Africa. And if we were to look at sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of things we see. And I know the Center for Social Flourishing talks about this, and the Poverty Inc. movie talks about this, but just the lack of rule of law and the lack of protection for private property and clear title for land, corruption in the bureaucracy,
constant war.
Warfare, conflict, what I would call crony capitalism, all those things work together to help keep people in poverty or create the conditions for poverty. So the second thing I would say is the claim that a free market economy will automatically solve the problem of poverty. There may be people who say that. I don't know any of them. They don't work for Acton Institute. I don't see them in our publications. They're certainly not in the Center for Social Flourishing. What I hear at Acton Institute events and in our publications is talk about the need for rule of law and a juridical framework and a subsidiary role for government and the creativity of the human person as individually unique and a creature who works, etc. And there's just a whole metaphysical grounding for what we would mean by a market. And we would never talk about the market as this thing, as you say, as a confluence of human choice events, etc. So the danger is that somebody reads that and they hear me talking about the free economy and the way John Paul talks about the free economy, and then the accusation will come with the free market fundamentalists. But I don't know any free market fundamentalists. I mean, I've read them, but they're libertarians and they're usually secular people.
Yeah.
So.
I think one of the interesting things when I was reading this is I was sort of struck by there are lively debates in sort of mainstream and mainline economics about the best metrics for assessing poverty, development, this sort of thing. There are a lot of people that are critical even of very, very basic sort of economic data sets like GDP or GDP per capita. And I'm not against such criticism. Like in principle, if we can come up with better measures, let's do it.
I went to the UN because Leo cites the UN, so I grabbed their statistics.
Yep, and these will never capture everything about the lives of people in the economy. These are just social scientists trying to do their best to measure and understand things in the world. And what we find that even when people come up with alternative measures to, let's say, GDP, they track very closely to it. And if we measure human well-being in a different way other than GDP per capita, that's high. It ends up being highly correlated with GDP per capita anyways. So economists are doing actually a very good job, not a perfect job, not a job that can't be improved, not a job that you can't bring a more holistic perspective to. There are a lot of even mainstream economists that have a very sort of rigid understanding of the economy that is, I'm much more in favor of a sort of market process understanding of the economy informed by the Austrian school. That is not mainstream economics, but it's a more humanistic understanding, I think. And there are criticisms that I think are valuable to be made. But I also think, you've got increasingly today, there is a lot of questioning of expertise around a lot of things. And there are a lot of experts who have failed in recent years. But the church should have a fundamentally constructive relationship to science. And it's dangerous if the church appears to devalue and dismiss science rather than try to make an active contribution to it, as it has throughout the life of the church. And that was my principal worry there.
So there's a problem with the empirical analysis in the exhortation and that empirical claims are made or they are dismissed. And I guess that's the most challenging part of this, that in a longer document, or I guess cited differently, I think that could have some weight as part of a debate. But there's a danger in dismissing empirical claims as pseudoscientific. Now, people will use and abuse empirical claims and data sets, and they do it all the time, and governments do it. And the U.S. government I think they're in the process of doing this, right? If you don't like the statistics on the economy or job growth or lack thereof, then you just fire the people who are gathering those, and you get new ones who will give you the data you want, and then you can claim it is what it is, whether it is or not, right? And so certainly that danger exists. But I think that's why reading this document as an exhortation and as a spiritual exercise was wonderful. But there are just these little parts where I just kind of wish there had been a little more detail, or said something a bit differently, just for sake of clarity, not so that it agrees with John Pinheiro. Like as John, I want to approach this and read it, and hopefully something changes, because I don't wake up every day thinking I'm have already achieved canonical status as a saint, etc. So I want to be exhorted. I want to learn and grow further in the truth. But so that's how I approach this.
One thing I would add on that as well. The early on in the document, I can't remember the exact paragraph number, but Leo cites approvingly, I don't know what the European community, what that body is exactly, but he cites a document of the European community, which used this definition of poverty, which is that the poor, this was published in 1984, the poor shall be taken to mean persons, families, and groups of persons whose resources, material, cultural, and social, are so limited as to exclude them from the minimum acceptable way of life in the member states in which they live. And so this is this idea of poverty as a kind of relative measure, right? It's relative within that society, and that's super important. Inequality is important that be kind of at the forefront of our discussion of poverty in a given place. But by focusing only on relative poverty, it can kind of blind us to the general improvement in living conditions, I think. And that is, by and large, the effect of, what we'll call the market, right? And that the conditions of the working class or the poor today versus what it was like in 1940 here in the United States, that there's a big difference there, right, between those in that time. And we can attribute that to economic growth and we can talk about those measures in terms of GDP and other things like that. But if we take for granted that those serious material benefits of the market, and we don't think about the origins of those benefits, and we don't give those to other countries, or kind of imparting those to other countries that don't have the institutions that make that happen, we're holding something very important and serious back from people who are in much worse conditions, in poverty. So I think as far as, so again, it would be nice to have more, a little more nuance in that discussion. But again, going back to what we've already said a few times, this is an exhortation, right? So it's looking for lots of nuance in this document. Maybe you're looking in the wrong spot.
There is a great point later in the document where Leo comes around to the constructive role that business and sort of economic growth and economy can play, and it's reached at rather obliquely and it's sort of noted matter-of-factly, but I think it's important to point out that in paragraph 115, Pope Leo reiterates that the most important way to help the disadvantaged is to assist them in finding a good job so that they can lead a more dignified life by developing their abilities and contributing their fair share. This is very important, and it attacks poverty in a multifaceted, more holistic way, because it does provide economic work. Of course, does provide economic resources, but it's also very important that he notes that it provides a dignified life, offering people an opportunity to develop their abilities and to contribute their fair share. Being able to be a contributing member of society is very important to people. It's very important to a positive conception of self, their own identity, their own dignity. Is
Yeah,
being
there's
able,
real joy in that because that's what you were created to be and to do, and being kept from that. I remember John Paul talking about the number of men in Poland. He would talk about 20 men with one broom in the same room, and there's just no dignity to that kind of work, even though you're bringing home a paycheck, because you're not actually working. The dignity of labor is just absent.
And this is something you see it in other places, and particularly in the social encyclicals of John Paul II, not just Sentimus Sanis, but some of the other encyclicals talk about sort of the dignity of labor. And, it's important to realize that this is why there's a social role for business and entrepreneurship in society, is to create. Businesses aren't just spreadsheets. They are people doing things, creating value for others in their community, serving others in their community. They are, it's not just this sort of frenetic, acquisitive thing. Like this provides real goods and real services to people, and provides people real means of providing for their families, of giving back to their own communities, and developing their skills in service to others. And I think that's really, really important and needs to be at the center of how we talk about poverty. In your work, Caleb, at the Center for Social Flourishing, how do you think about sort of the social nature of business?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I think about the quote we were talking about a little while ago about how, there's kind of specious talk of free markets automatically solving poverty, right? And that's, that's of course, it doesn't work like that. And especially in the United States, where we do have a kind of freedom of, we don't have the same problems in the United States that they have in in large parts of the developing world. You can register a business even if you're in poverty, right? You can, if you can kind of if you can figure out how to kind of make things happen, you're not going to be excluded from different institutions in the way that that you might be excluded in other parts of the world. But there are serious problems of exclusion. So we're making this documentary film, right, which is a kind of sequel in a sense to Poverty Inc., which focused on poverty in the developing world, but this one's focused on poverty in the United States. And we've gone to some really rough parts of the country, right? You go pop into some of these places, and it's like, this is the same country that I live in, but it's a very different place. Jackson, Mississippi, for instance, by some measures, the murder capital of the United States, and it is a very different place, than Grand Rapids, Michigan. But one community that we visited, Bonton, in the Bonton neighborhood in South Dallas, this is a neighborhood that through tragic historical circumstances, some sort of pathological things going on in the neighborhood, was just totally cut off from the rest of Dallas. I mean, like literally, in the sense that there were walls built around it, and there were because of the flooding in that area, and the gates, when it flooded, gates would shut, right, and it'd be literally like walled off from the rest of the city. So what is helping that neighborhood look like, right? It's connecting it to the rest of Dallas, right, which is this incredible engine of economic productivity, right, and of wealth creation. And so we tell this story in the film of kind of how Bonton has got connected to the rest of Dallas, and a lot of what the kind of more you could say like civil society approaches to poverty alleviation in that community has been, that's made possible through business, right? Like there's wealth that's being generated, and that is coming to that community in different ways, through individuals, through particular projects, because that wealth exists, right? For civil society to exist, there has to some extent be a commercial society, right? The relationship between those two is important, and it's intimate, and it's very hard to have one without the other, right? And so the project of Bonton has been, I think, creating, is a sense, there was a kind of desert of like real institutions there that were helping people kind of develop, right, and get plugged into the rest of Dallas, and I think that business plays a role in kind of, it needs to be directed by good people, but these institutions of human formation are often lacking in these in poor communities here in the United States that are really kind of developing people, getting them ready to compete in the workforce. And so I think business has a great role of kind of looking at that landscape and seeing, okay, how can we contribute to some of these other kind of non-economic institutions, whether it's schools, whether it's nonprofits, whatever, that can kind of come alongside people and assist in their formation. Again, that requires resources, and so broadly speaking, I would say that business has that role to play.
Excellent.
Yeah, Pope Leo is very intent on talking about context, so he mainly means historical context. But going from what Caleb's talking about the Center for Social Flourishing, and the reason there's Poverty, Inc. and now this upcoming sequel to Poverty, Inc. is poverty alleviation looks very different in the developed versus the developing world because the causes are often different, right? And so particularly in the United States and in the West and in the very developed East, I would say, South Asia and East Asia, those places where poverty has dropped exponentially, really, in the past couple of decades, according to UN statistics. In those kind of places, we need to be talking about the good that business does, and we need to be asking those kind of questions like, so how should we care for the poor? Who are the poor? What's the danger here of turning the poor into an object, and almost like a devotional object? The poor, a devotional object that helps me get saved and grow closer to Jesus. I mean, there's different ways to objectify the poor, and Pope Leo talks about this. He quotes, actually, he almost quotes Poverty Incorporated, but it's John Paul stuff, right? The poor. He says their silent work. He's talking about the Benedictines, was the leaven of a new civilization where the poor were not a problem to be solved, but brothers and sisters to be welcomed. That is not objects, not a problem, but people that you walk with and to and help and have a relationship with. And a relationship's a lot different than just giving people stuff. So why are they poor? What can be done so they're not poor? There's a lot of complexity. Again, this isn't just about stuff. To make it about inequality of stuff, I think misses all the social and personal causes of poverty. There's that interesting, it's the cover story in The New Religion and Liberty by Rachel Ferguson, and it's on the work that Dr. Anthony Bradley, one of our research affiliates, or one of our research fellows, did with the young homeless couple in Grand Rapids. And he helped them out in all sorts of ways, but you come to find out that their biggest problem was not having a home. It was past sexual abuse, contemporary drug abuse, physical abuse. There were all kinds of struggles they were facing, and this was the root of their poverty, right? Getting them a home, buying them food, none of that worked. I mean, it's a very interesting story to read. And it's a very eye-opening story to read. We need to be careful of, I guess, perpetuating that idea that you just kind of give them those things and you've solved poverty for them with all of your planning. That all they needed was food and shelter, like the just purely kind of like the Marxist approach that it's all about food and shelter. And so Anthony Bradley, our research fellow, talks about the importance of fathers in the home. Now, there's real empirical data that shows that plays a key role in causing future poverty in the children and inability to function and executive decisions and a whole host of issues. And so I think of poverty in this exhortation, and he does talk about it as complicated, Leo does, but it's very complex, but I think it's different, not just in different times, but certainly in different places. So I think it's great that you all are working on the new film, for instance, because that was long the critique of Poverty, Inc. is, what about poverty in the United States? How would you approach that? Mm-hmm. And in some ways, it's more difficult because the solution's much less obvious and seems counterintuitive sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think not sure where this is from, and this might be a kind of paraphrase, but I think John Paul II defines poverty somewhere as exclusion from networks of productivity and exchange.
Yeah, circles of exchange.
Yeah. And I think that is a much more kind of apropos definition of poverty, especially in the United States, where there's stuff everywhere in this country, and there's nonprofits who are trying to, help people and so forth. And so like people can get material aid, but the more fundamental question is, how do we take these marginalized communities, marginalized people who are marginalized because of historical, situations, who maybe, prejudices past or present, or because of, some of these problems of family breakdown and other things, where they're kind of outside of, sort of like mainstream, culture in America. How do we kind of bring these people back, like, into the fold, right? How do we connect with them so that they are part of those circles of exchange? And that's, to John's point, that's a complicated question. But in this document, there's a lot of language of kind of walking alongside people, and that's key. Yeah.
The cultural breakdown. I know you're working on the film, and a lot of this is caused and exacerbated by government planning, by tearing out functioning neighborhoods and replacing them with non-functioning neighborhoods, and getting rid of the generational wealth and the social networks. So you imagine the social network an intact family has, with lots of family members who are working and who have been to college, and you can see that the results of their labors leads to something good and builds wealth. And then you go to an example where there aren't intact families, and there's nobody in the neighborhood who looks like they're doing well, and the only people who are doing well are criminals, and then you grow up to imitate them because you think a job's a waste of time. And those are very complicated. So when John Paul talks about working, what he's not saying, and I think what he's not saying, and what shouldn't be said, is they just get a job, bum. Just get a job. That's not what's being said at all. So it's laborem exercens that is the other encyclical you're probably trying to think of. And I quote, he says, "Human work is a key, probably the essential key to the whole social question." And that's what when Pope Leo quotes St. John Paul, that's what he's quoting in that little history of different social encyclicals since Rerum Novarum, written by Leo XIII.
Let's complicate this once more and return to this, because Leo returns to this in the exhortation. So there's a situation of poverty in the developing world. There's a situation of poverty in the developed world. And then there are vast amounts of people today that are migrating from one to the other. Paragraphs 73 to 75 are focused on the duty to accompany migrants, drawing our attention to migration in the scriptures. So a little case study of 19th century European migration, and then the present work of the church among migrants. Paragraph 75 concludes by saying, "The church, like a mother, accompanies those who are walking. Where the world sees threats, she sees children. Where walls are built, she builds bridges. She knows that her proclamation of the gospel is credible only when it is translated into gestures of closeness and welcome. And she knows that in every rejected migrant, it is the church himself who knocks at the door of the community. It is Christ himself who knocks at the door of the community." End quote. This has been something that has sort of, migration in Europe, migration into North America has fundamentally altered the politics of two continents. It has been an extremely politically destabilizing issue. Migrants face real challenges coming from societies in which rule of law, clean title to land, all that sort of stuff, where there are real obstacles to flourishing. Most of these migrants are economic migrants. That is not to minimize their plight. Material deprivation is real in much of the world and is terrifying. And they are seeking situations, contexts where they can actually get plugged in to a functioning economy, where they can raise their children where they can flourish. But this is complicated in all sorts of ways, and is politically very complicated right now through much of the developed world. What did the two of you make of this section on migration? And is migration something we should think about when we think about the poor?
Well, okay. We've been trading.
Oh, yeah.
This
Well,
one.
no,
I jump in?
I can say, yeah.
Oh,
I can,
okay.
Yeah,
I don't want to.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think, I've talked to some folks locally who are involved with caring for or helping out migrants, who are here in the Grand Rapids area, and they're Catholics, and their philosophy on it is basically, don't know about the politics of it, but they're here and we just got to help them, right? And I think that I would second Pope Francis, hard to remember. Well, anyways, there was that little kind of, it was Pope Francis, sorry, that kind of back and forth between Pope Francis and the vice president at some point over.
Yes.
Yeah. Over the, and I guess I think maybe Leo sent a tweet, or then Robert Francis Prevost sent a tweet about it. But there was that kind of controversy, right, over the Order Amoris and the Good Samaritan and all that. And I think that an important, and I don't know how constructive that whole debate was, but I think an important kind of upshot of the Good Samaritan is that, of the Good Samaritan parable, is that if something happens in front of you, right, if you are encountering human suffering in front of you, then as a Christian, politics of the situation, whatever they are, you're called to respond, right? And Benedict XVI is really good on this in Jesus of Nazareth, where he in his kind of exegesis of the parable of the Good Samaritan, he talks about putting a kind of modern person in the shoes of the Samaritan, and seeing the man who's on the side of the road, and kind of worrying about whether you have the expertise to help that person, or if you have the kind of the ability to help that person, and instead having this kind of posture of, like, I got to help. If I see kind of real suffering in front of me, I got to help in some way. And there's prudence involved in that as well, with different situations you encounter. But to me, this is not a nuanced discussion of immigration policy or what rule of law has to do with managing borders and that sort of thing. But certainly reading this as an American in this context, in which I would personally maybe see more of a role for, kind of managing borders in a kind of orderly way, than we've seen more recently. However, there's definitely at this moment a real danger in the kind of pendulum swinging very far in the opposite direction, where there does seem to be a kind of lack of appreciation of the dignity of people who have come to this country seeking a better life. And so I read these few paragraphs as a serious exhortation that, this is just kind of fundamentally true. Like these people have dignity, right? Yeah. And even if they're being deported, if they're not being deported, like, they have dignity, and they need to be respected. Anyway, so I guess I read it in that, like, I don't see there need to be any kind of nuance in this discussion, because the pendulum is kind of, certainly in the American context, the pendulum is swung very far in one direction, and we need to be brought back toward the middle.
Yeah, I thought this was actually one of the best parts of the exhortation, in that it was short, and it was to the point, and to your point, I think was migration, immigration. We don't just want to think about the countries that are disrupted by large numbers of immigrants, especially this has occurred in Europe, in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, but also the countries they're leaving and why they're leaving. And you might be, you might be an economic migrant looking for opportunity, but if you're fleeing Venezuela, you're fleeing a lot more, for instance, than just lack of economic opportunity. I mean, you're fleeing a corrupt socialist regime that's autocratic, and this is what's causing the problem. So I heard Father Sirico on a news program. This was maybe a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, not sure exactly, but he was asked this question. Like, so what do you do? He said, it's not an either or. And I agree with him. It's not an either or question like you just build a wall and you keep them out. Well, no. And so what he said, and I think this makes sense, and this is what I think we're exhorted to do, is you think about the sources of the problem, what's causing the migration in the first place. But when there's somebody in front of you, so you pass by so you're the indifferent rich man who's used as an example of what not to be, and you walk by the man with the sores every day outside your door. You never give him your scraps. You don't do anything. You're the exact opposite of the Good Samaritan. You're indifferent rather than showing the concern and having the real concern. So you don't walk by somebody like that and say, you know what he needs? He needs to be in a circle of exchange. What would really help him is some spontaneous order right now.
He just needs a free market.
He just needs to be blessed by the free market. No, there's a great difference between alms and emergency aid on the one hand, and then addressing the root causes of this kind of poverty, which is social as well as it is material. And the empirical evidence is pretty clear on the amount of people who've suffered from sexual abuse who end up homeless as opposed to haven't. I mean, some psychologists have told me, though now this is anecdotal, not empirical, that nearly all, which seems statistically unreal, but this person's the one who deals with this. So I guess I would say when it comes to migration, we have the issue, particularly in Africa. It's not just migration from Africa, but it's from rural areas to urban areas, and then the growth in those urban areas where there isn't good planning at all, right, and corruption, et cetera, and then from other places to more developed areas. So there's different kinds of migration, of course. And so on the one hand, if you don't have stable borders and protected borders, the culture of a country can be diminished, and that's problematic for the people already there. But it's also bad. It's also bad for especially the women and the children. So you think of human trafficking and suffering, and I think that's maybe what you're getting at about secure borders that are actually safe, a generous but safe immigration process. Our COO at Acton, Steve Barrows, wrote a great piece a while back I think it was for Religion and Liberty Online, and he just took Acton's core principles and said, what would happen if we applied these to immigration? What would that look like? So countries have a right to preserve themselves. You don't want 6 billion people coming to one country. You want them to flourish in their own home country, in their own place, where they want to be, all things being equal, right? And so how do you balance those things? It's a very good, very, very, very good piece. I think it's one of the best things we've had on Religion and Liberty Online when it comes to immigration, because it's just showing the complexity of the issue. But what you can't do as a Christian is say, prudentially, I'm just going to keep walking by this person, or I'm just, the immigrants in front of me, I see Jesus in front of me right now. But that doesn't mean I want open borders and human trafficking and drugs and criminal elements, et cetera. It just means this is, I'm seeing Jesus here right now. I'm going to help this kid, right? And I'm probably not going to deport a grandmother who's been in the United States for 20 years and call her a criminal because she immigrated illegally the first time. Maybe there's a better way, in other words. Like, let's do some real thinking on this.
So bring us to this person in front of us is exactly where Pope Leo ends his exhortation, which is on this ending section on almsgiving. We talked a little bit about the work that churches are doing today. We talked a little bit, but let's use our imaginations a little bit for this last one, and think about if we're properly exhorted by this exhortation, how do we rethink our almsgiving in light of it? and how did it help you sort of rethink and reevaluate a topic that I know that both of you have thought an awful lot about before this exhortation? But, this comes before us. We read it, we listen, and, and we digest. And maybe these things cause us to revisit things in new ways or to become rededicated in some ways that, perhaps we realized we hadn't been as dedicated as we should have been. Yeah. What do you think, Caleb?
Yeah. I'd love to share another quote from Mother Teresa, or John Paul II and Mother Teresa, and which really struck my heart. I'll kind of explain what I mean. So in paragraph 77, John Paul II is quoted. He says, "Where did Mother Teresa find this strength to place herself completely at the service of others? She found it in prayer and in the silent contemplation of Jesus Christ, his holy face, his sacred heart. She herself said as much," and this is Mother Teresa, "The fruit of silence is prayer, the fruit of prayer is faith, the fruit of faith is love, the fruit of love is service." And John Paul says, "It was prayer that filled her heart with Christ's own peace and enabled her to radiate that peace to others." So I just think that's beautiful. And I think and Leo makes this point several times throughout the document, that the love that we have for Christ in the Eucharist needs to kind of translate to love of neighbor, right? The love of God needs to translate to love of neighbor. And so I think that it's a great exhortation to think creatively in how to make that translation. Yeah, and make that a kind of fundamental part of your Christian witness.
The whole exhortation is a good reminder to make sure that any Christian charity doesn't creep into becoming a kind of secular humanitarianism. So on the one hand, you could read this document and say, "Oh, I need to give more alms," and then the next thing you know, you're just a humanitarian and you're not engaging in charity. So I would agree with Caleb. It's that exhortation to see Christ in other people, to truly love your neighbor, but to ask what does that really mean? Right? And what does it mean when we think of poverty? And what would it mean how can I accompany somebody? Does it mean just giving money? Does it mean writing a check? Does it mean further engagement in civil society? Does it mean opposing government policies that are actually more detrimental to the poor than help for the poor? Does it mean continued wariness of the UN, whose solution to poverty, if you look at its development goals, and involves abortion, particularly in the third world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa? Is that I don't think that's the solution to poverty. So as an exhortation, I thought this was very much a spiritual success, and I liked reading the history. So for me, the best part was just that history beginning with Scripture and going all the way through the Middle Ages. And I wish it would have continued on to the benefits of the commercial society, but kind of skips over a few hundred years to get to the present. But at least we get that sense that the church has always done this, that it's part of what it means to be a Christian, that the treasury of the church's social teaching, the Catholic Church's social teaching, is the phrase Leo likes to use quite a bit, that it really is a treasury, and that this charity, almsgiving, this is part of what it means to be Christian. It's not an add-on. It's not an addition. It's not something that I have to reach the level of piety that Caleb has, and then I'm able to do it. Like, I should be doing it. I should be doing it now, right? Not waiting till I'm saintly like my colleague here.
Leo exhorts us all towards the end that love is above all a way of looking at life and a way of living it. A church that sets no limits to love, that knows no enemies to fight, but only men and women to love, is the church that the world needs today. Thank you both for being with us, and let's try to be what the world needs today.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.